Have you ever found yourself, completely sucked into a personality test?
Oh, absolutely. It happens all the time.
Yeah. Maybe it was just like a quick online quiz, the kind that promises to reveal which The Office character you are based on your coffee order or something silly like that.
Or maybe something
Yeah.
a bit more serious, like for a job application.
Exactly. Or maybe you just sought one out yourself, trying to genuinely understand yourself a bit better. Whatever it was, what did it tell you? And I guess the real question is, does it actually feel right? Did it resonate deep down? Because if you've done any of that, you've basically tapped into this really universal human thing, our fascination with understanding ourselves, and just as much understanding other people.
It's a profound truth, isn't it? That inherent curiosity about us, our personalities. It's incredibly powerful. And it's exactly why we seem so drawn to these kinds of tools.
Yeah, whether they're just, floating around on social media or being used in like serious professional settings. And that's exactly what we're doing today. We are launching into a deep dive, really getting into the world of personality tests.
We're going to focus on the two big ones, the ones you hear about most often, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, the MBTI, and the Big Five.
Yeah, we're going to unpack how they're different. And believe me, they are different. We'll look at their scientific backing, or sometimes, as you'll hear, the controversy around that.
And also how they're actually used out there in the real world, the applications.
Our mission here really is to cut through all the noise. We want to look at the actual source material, everything from, dense academic studies to popular articles, even discussions on forums like Reddit.
Yeah, trying to pull out the most important insights about these tools. Why are they so compelling? What are their real strengths? And just as importantly, their weaknesses.
And how are they being used? Or sometimes maybe misused, because that happens too, right? In everything from just personal growth journeys to like major corporate hiring decisions.
Yeah.
So get ready for maybe some aha moments and maybe some unexpected facts that might make you rethink what you thought you knew about these tests.
Yeah, this isn't just about sticking labels on people, is it?
Not at all. It's about understanding that complex, kind of beautiful dance of human behavior and how these systems try to map it out.
It's about seeing how they offer a lens, maybe, to understand ourselves a bit more deeply and maybe find that sense of belonging we're all kind of searching for.
Okay, let's jump right in. Segment 1, the enduring appeal. Why are we so drawn to these things? I mean, my own social media feed, it's like Molly Longman from Refinery 29 wrote, it's flooded with them.
Yeah, mine too sometimes.
She literally calls personality quizzes her drug, says she sends them to all her friends trying to figure out, are you the INFJ to my ENFP? Or even like, which office couple are we? Or what kind of dog am I? It's funny, but it points to something deeper, right?
Oh, absolutely. You've hit on something really fundamental there. That widespread appeal, it connects directly to some basic psychological needs we all have.
Like,
well, for starters, personality tests can be what one source calls a low-effort resource for jump-starting self-awareness. I mean, think about it. Our inner lives are complicated, sometimes kind of chaotic, right?
definitely.
These tests offer a structured way, a framework to categorize and summarize who we are. They help make sense of our own patterns, our preferences. It's almost like getting a simplified user manual for your own head.
Huh, a user manual. I like that. So it's like a shortcut to self-knowledge, a way to put words to feelings we already have.
Exactly. They give you a vocabulary, a tangible structure for those internal experiences. But it's more than just understanding ourselves in isolation.
Okay.
They also tap into this dual need. We have the need to feel unique, special, right? But also the need to belong, to feel connected to a group.
That individuality versus tribalism thing.
Precisely. Personality tests kind of nail both. They let you reflect on what makes you pick your specific style. But they also offer this reassurance that, hey, your unique style, it's shared by others. You're not alone in it.
Yeah, I totally get that. That line from one source, I am French fry, and that's that. It perfectly captures that feeling, right? That comfort in knowing your specific brand of weirdness isn't just you. I heard this story about an artist back in high school who felt like a total outsider. It's completely different from everyone.
Yeah.
Then she took an MBTI test, and suddenly she felt seen, understood. She realized there were other people like her, That her way of seeing the world wasn't some flaw, it was actually a recognized pattern.
Wow. That must have been powerful.
Yeah. That sense of finally fitting in, even if it's just inside a personality type category, that can be incredibly comforting, like finding your tribe almost.
And that appeal, it stretches beyond just knowing ourselves. It affects how we deal with other people too, right? Social interaction is complex.
Super complex.
These tests offer what seems like a simple shorthand for navigating that complexity. The idea is you activate a schema, like a mental template, that guides how you understand and react to someone.
So if you know someone's an ISFJ, or say a 7 on the Enneagram.
Right. You feel like you instantly have this sort of pre-made map for engaging with them, what might motivate them, how they might react. It's a way to try and make sense of all the different ways people behave.
Even if, as one source warns, those maps are only as good as the information they're based on.
Exactly. Accuracy matters.
Okay, so these mental shortcuts make sense for personal understanding. But this curiosity, it naturally bleeds over into the professional world, doesn't it? It's not just about self-discovery anymore.
Oh, absolutely. Personality testing has really cemented itself as a critical tool in so many sectors. We're talking hiring, team building, leadership development, even conflict resolution.
How widespread is it really?
Our sources suggest it's huge. Around 70%, 0% of Fortune 500 companies apparently use personality assessments in their recruitment process alone.
70%. Wow, okay, so this isn't just some fringe HR trend. It's mainstream. It's serious business.
Totally. And the reported benefits? They're pretty compelling. Sources mention things like 60% of companies seeing improved team dynamics after bringing in personality testing.
60% is significant.
And get this, some organizations using, robust, validated assessments have even reported up to a 23% increase in profitability.
Profitability, how does that connection work?
Well, they're used for evaluating things like cultural fit, building more compatible teams, streamlining communication. The idea is it leads to more cohesive, effective teams, which impacts the bottom line.
Okay, that makes sense. Better teamwork, better results.
Right. And the sheer number of tests being taken, over 2 million completed every month across different platforms like Myers-Briggs and the Big Five inventory, it just underscores how much impact these things are having on how companies operate.
Okay, now, if you're listening, you might hear MBTI and Big Five and think, all right, 2 different tests, probably similar ideas, right? Just different versions.
Yeah, that's a really common assumption.
But here's where our deep dive gets, well, really fascinating, because the sources show a contrast that's actually pretty stark. They're not just slightly different, they're fundamentally different systems.
Completely different animals, really.
So this brings us to segment 2, decoding the 2 giants. MBTI versus the Big Five. Let's dig into those fundamental differences.
Yeah, let's do it. And it really starts right at the beginning with their origins and their whole foundational philosophy.
Okay, so where did the MBTI come from?
Its roots are in Carl Jung's work, specifically his 1921 book, Psychological Types. But the story's actually pretty interesting. Catherine Cook Briggs, who was just a really keen observer of people, started her own research into personality way back in 1917.
Before Jung's book was even translated.
Yeah. She had her own simple system, 4 types: meditative, spontaneous, executive, and social. Then Jung's work came out in English in 1923.
And she saw similarities.
She did. She recognized his theory resembled hers, but as she put it, it went far beyond her own ideas. So she, along with her daughter, Isabel Briggs Myers, and it's worth noting, neither had formal psychology training.
Right, that's a key point.
They decided to take Jung's complex theoretical ideas and turn them into something more practical, more accessible.
Why then? Was there a specific need?
Well, this was during World War II. Their initial goal was pretty pragmatic. Help people find work that suited them, help them understand each other better, to, contribute to the war effort. Isabel Myers particularly felt Jung's concepts were brilliant, but maybe a bit dense. Her mission was to make them easier for everyday people to grasp and use.
Okay, so MBTI came from applying Jung's theory, making it practical, driven by a wartime need. How does that compare to the Big Five's origin story? Sounds different already.
Oh, incredibly different. The Big Five is often called the bedrock of modern academic psychological research. It didn't spring from one person's theory or a specific practical need like the MBTI did.
So where did it come from?
It emerged over decades, really, from painstaking empirical research. Lots of different psychologists working independently used rigorous statistical methods. They basically analyzed huge amounts of data on how people describe themselves and others.
Like looking for patterns in language.
Exactly. Using factor analysis on personality descriptors, asking what are the most fundamental, universal dimensions that keep showing up again and again. It was this data-driven scientific approach that led to the 5 core factors and why it's now considered the academic standard for personality testing.
Wow. So one based on interpreting a theory, the other built up from analyzing massive amounts of data. That's a huge difference right
It
there.
really is. And that foundational difference leads directly to how they actually measure personality, type versus trait.
Okay, explain that. How does the MBTI measure things? You get a type, right?
Right. MBTI uses a category-based approach. It looks at 4 pairs of preferences, dichotomies, and decides which side you prefer for each. You're either E or I, S or N, T or F, J or P.
So it forces a choice.
It forces a choice, yeah. And that combination gives you one of 16 distinct types. The Myers-Briggs company uses this analogy of handedness.
Handedness. How does that work?
They say the MBTI aims to find out which hand you prefer to use, the one that feels most natural, comfortable, efficient, even though obviously you can use both. It's about identifying that dominant preference. It essentially puts you in a box based on that preference.
Got it. So it's not measuring how well you use your non-dominant hand, just which one's your default.
Precisely. Now contrast that with the Big Five. It measures traits on continuous scales.
Meaning?
Instead of a fixed type, like ENTJ, you get a percentage score for each of the 5 factors. It tells you where you fall on the spectrum for openness, conscientiousness, and so on.
Ah, so back to the handedness analogy.
The Big Five would measure how much you use both hands. And it would likely find most people aren't purely right-handed or left-handed, but somewhere in the middle, maybe a bit ambidextrous.
You know, what's really fascinating here, and maybe something we don't think about enough, is how this measurement difference actually shapes how we see ourselves.
How so?
Well, the MBTI, with its neat box, it gives you this really clear, easy-to-grasp story, a narrative. You are an INFJ, and this is what that means. It's comforting, right? Like finding your label, your identity.
Yeah, I can see that.
But the Big Five, it gives you coordinates on a map. You're 70% on extroversion, 40% on agreeableness. It forces a more nuanced, maybe less immediately satisfying understanding. It's less about a fixed identity and more like a dynamic profile.
That's a brilliant way to put it. The structure of the test really influences the story we tell ourselves. And that connects directly to another key difference.
Yeah.
How they view the changeability, the malleability of personality.
Okay, how does the MBTI see that, fixed or changeable?
The MBTI claims to measure deep, unconscious ways of making judgments and perceiving the world, core preferences. This implies your type is pretty fixed. It has to stay the same, theoretically.
Even if your test results change over time. We'll get to reliability later, but that seems like a contradiction.
It is a point of tension, yeah. According to the theory, if your actual type changed, it would mean fundamentally altering your functional stack, those core cognitive functions, which is seen as pretty stable, almost inherent.
So if I test as an ENFP today, the theory says I'm always an ENFP at my core, even if I test differently later. That feels a bit limiting, doesn't it? It kind of clashes with ideas of personal growth.
That's the underlying MBTI premise, yes. Your core preferences are stable. The Big Five, though, takes a totally different stance. It measures conscious personality traits that are explicitly understood to be changeable.
How so? Can you give an example?
Sure. Our sources say things like, if you consistently work on your planning and organization skills, your conscientiousness score can actually increase over time. It's measurable. Or, conversely, if someone goes through really significant negative life events, their neuroticism score might increase. These traits aren't seen as set in stone. They're dynamic, influenced by life, by effort, by conscious behavioral changes.
And that leads to this really interesting point someone made on Reddit about how we perceive these traits. They said, very few people want to identify as a bad thing.
That rings true.
Their argument was that the Big Five isn't as popular maybe in casual settings because it can describe traits that people might see as bad, like scoring low on agreeableness. That might sound negative, right?
Yeah, it could be interpreted that way initially.
Whereas with MBTI, if you're a thinker, which might correlate with lower agreeableness, it's framed differently. It's presented as having all these other skills, like being logical or objective. It creates a more positive spin, a better narrative.
That's a really sharp observation about the psychological appeal. But what's fascinating is that the Big Five, while it might seem to label some traits negatively at first glance, actually offers a more nuanced and potentially empowering view.
How do you mean?
Well, like that same Reddit user, Gurma Monster, pointed out, disagreeable people might be harder to get along with, but they could be funnier, stick up for themselves more, and speak more truthfully in difficult situations.
So it's not just bad, it's context dependent. There are upsides and downsides to everything.
Exactly. Every dimension on the Big Five has potential positives and negatives depending on the situation. High agreeableness sounds great, but maybe you struggle to assert your needs. Low neuroticism is good for stress, but maybe you're less sensitive to risks. The Big Five gives you a map of these tendencies, helping you understand your strengths and areas where you might want to develop skills. It's not just a label, it's a profile on a spectrum.
That's a much more holistic way to look at it, I think. Recognizing strengths and challenges in every trait, not just sorting into good or bad. Okay, let's dive a bit deeper into the MBTI itself now. Segment 3. A closer look at the MBTI, its design and intentions.
Right. So as we said, it's based on Carl Jung's theory of psychological types. Jung proposed these four main psychological functions: sensation, intuition, feeling, and thinking. And he believed one of these tends to be dominant for each person.
But crucially, Myers and Briggs didn't just, translate Jung directly, did they? The sources emphasize they made pretty significant changes and additions.
That's absolutely critical and often missed. Jung's original work was more of a complex philosophical exploration of tendencies. He didn't really see people fitting into neat, exclusive boxes. His model was quite intricate, involving functions having both extroverted and introverted forms.
So, more fluid.
Definitely more fluid. Myers and Briggs took that complex theory and essentially engineered a practical tool from it. That required simplification, turning those tendencies into measurable dichotomies. Their biggest addition was that fourth pair, judging perceiving. That wasn't one of Jung's fundamental attitudes in the same way. It was their innovation to make the system work for categorization.
So this really begs the question, how much of the MBTI is pure Jung, and how much is the Myers-Briggs interpretation and expansion?
It's clearly an extrapolation, and that extrapolation, as we'll get into, is where some of the scientific criticisms come from later. It's not a direct translation, it's their practical framework built upon Jung's ideas.
Okay. And that framework gives us those four dichotomies we talked about, which combine to make the 16 types. Let's quickly define those again, focusing on the specific MBTI meanings. First, extroversion, E, introversion, I. How do they define energy?
Right. In MBTI terms, it's about your source and direction of energy. Extroverts draw energy from action. They tend to think aloud, act first, then reflect. Too much quiet time can actually drain them. They need external stimulation to recharge.
And introverts?
Introverts expend energy through action. They prefer to reflect internally first, then act. They need quiet time alone, away from external buzz, to recharge their batteries.
So it's really about where you get your energy, the outer world or the inner world.
Yeah.
And that leads to different styles, right? Action versus thought, breadth versus depth.
Exactly. Then you have sensing, S, intuition, N. This is about how you prefer to take in information.
Sensing is about the concrete.
Yes. Sensing types focus on facts, details, what's real and tangible now. They trust their five senses and concrete data.
And intuition.
Intuitive types are drawn more to patterns, possibilities, future implications, abstract ideas. They like reading between the lines, looking at the big picture, exploring what could be.
Okay. Next, thinking, T, feeling, F.
This one gets misunderstood a lot, doesn't it? Like it's just logic versus emotion.
Hugely misunderstood. It's critical to remember. In MBTI, these are ways of making decisions. They're judging functions. It's not about intelligence or how emotional you are.
So thinkers aren't necessarily smarter, and feelers aren't necessarily more emotional? Correct. Thinking types tend to make decisions based on objective logic, consistency, principles, fairness according to rules. Feeling types prioritize values, harmony, the impact on people, and subjective circumstances. Both are seen as rational ways to decide within the MBTI system.
Got it. And finally, judging, J, perceiving, P. This is about your lifestyle, how you approach the outer world.
Exactly. Judging types prefer their outer life to be structured, organized, planned, decided. They like closure. Perceiving types prefer flexibility, spontaneity, adaptability, keeping options open.
And just to reiterate, judging doesn't mean being judgmental.
Absolutely not. It just means preferring structure and decisions in the external world. Perceiving means preferring flexibility and openness.
Okay, so one preference from each pair gives you the 16 types, like INTJ or ESFP. But there's more to it, right? This type dynamics idea, the functional stack.
Yes. Myers and Briggs added this concept of a functional stack, a hierarchy of your cognitive functions. You have a dominant function, your main go-to. Then an auxiliary function that supports and balances the dominant, usually developing in your teens.
Like a co-pilot.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
Then a tertiary function, emerging more in midlife. And finally, the inferior function, your least developed one, sometimes called the shadow. It can pop up under stress.
So Connecting this to the bigger picture, this stack idea tries to explain how personality isn't totally static, how it can evolve and develop within your type framework, like learning to use your non-dominant hand better over time.
That's the theoretical goal, yes,
Okay, yeah.
to show growth and flexibility within the type. However, it's really important to stress that both Jung's original ideas and this MBTI functional stack concept, they remain hypothetical. Meaning our sources point out there's a real lack of controlled scientific studies that actually support either the stack theory or the underlying model in a rigorous way. It's an appealing narrative, but the empirical proof just isn't there, according to critics.
Okay, so we've unpacked the MBTI's structure and intentions. Now let's shift focus fully to its counterpart, the Big Five, often called the academic standard. This is segment 4.
Right. The Big Five really boils personality down to what decades of research suggest are 5 broad, fundamental dimensions. And the acronym OCEAN is a handy way to remember them.
And crucially, these are spectrums, right? Percentages, not boxes.
Exactly. Continuous scales. So first up is O, openness to experience.
What does that measure?
It's about how receptive you are to new ideas, new experiences, creativity. High scorers tend to be imaginative, curious, like variety, maybe into art or abstract thinking. Low scorers tend to be more conventional, prefer routine, more comfortable with the familiar.
Okay. Then C, conscientiousness.
This is about organization, responsibility, discipline, being goal-oriented. High scorers are often reliable, prepared, diligent, like planning. Low scorers might be more spontaneous, adaptable, less focused on rigid structure, maybe sometimes struggle with follow-through.
Next, E, extroversion. Similar name to MBTI's, but measured differently.
Similar concept, social engagement, assertiveness, energy from interaction, but measured on that continuous scale. High scorers are outgoing, sociable, energized by people. Low scorers, often called introverted in this model, are more reserved, thoughtful, need solitude to recharge.
Got it. Fourth is A, agreeableness.
This reflects how cooperative, compassionate, and considerate you are. High scorers are often trusting, kind, prioritize harmony. Low scorers might be more competitive, skeptical, direct, maybe more likely to challenge things or speak tough truths.
And finally, N, neuroticism.
This is about emotional stability versus instability. High neuroticism means a tendency towards anxiety, worry, sadness, feeling negative emotions more often or intensely, maybe reacting more strongly to stress. Low neuroticism indicates more emotional stability, resilience, calmness under pressure.
And this N factor, neuroticism, is really important in psychology research, isn't it?
Hugely important. It's strongly linked to mental well-being, risk for anxiety, and depression. It's a core part of understanding psychological health.
Okay, so you get a score on each of these 5 spectrums, and you said this is the academic standard. Why is it so respected in research circles?
It really comes down to its scientific rigor. It's based on objective measurement, it's been replicated across different cultures, and it has strong predictive validity for many life outcomes.
Predictive validity, like what?
Things like job performance, academic success, relationship satisfaction, even health outcomes. Social psychologists value it because it connects to measurable things.
You mentioned a wild study earlier about pheromones.
Oh, yeah. That grad student study is apparently staggeringly accurate.
Huh?
Women could supposedly guess men's Big Five scores just by smelling the armpit area of their workout shirts.
Seriously, that's wow.
I know, it sounds unbelievable. But it illustrates the point. These Big Five dimensions seem to be linked to tangible, even biological aspects of who we are. It's that level of empirical grounding and predictive power that gives it such weight in academic settings.
Okay, well, here's where things get really interesting, maybe even a bit uncomfortable for people who love the MBTI. Despite its huge popularity, the MBTI has faced some incredibly sharp criticism from the scientific community. This is segment 5, the crossroads of science validity, reliability, and critiques.
Yeah, this is where the gloves really come off in the academic world. The consensus among most research psychologists is pretty blunt.
Yeah.
The MBTI is widely regarded as pseudoscience.
Pseudoscience, that's a strong word.
It is. And you hear other harsh assessments too. Things like pretty much meaningless, one of the worst personality tests, an elaborate Chinese fortune cookie, even disguised astrology.
Wow, okay. Why such intense criticism? What are the main scientific complaints?
It often boils down to the lack of rigorous independent evidence. A huge red flag for scientists is the lack of independent research.
What do you mean by independent?
Well, sources point out that something like a third to a half of all the published studies supporting the MBTI actually come from the organization that promotes it, the Center for the Application of Psychological Type, or their own journal.
Ah, so the research supporting it often comes from the people selling it.
Exactly. That raises immediate questions about potential bias, conflict of interest. Science relies on independent verification, and when outside researchers do look at those pro-MBTI studies, they often find them methodologically weak or unscientific. It feels like an internal echo chamber to many critics.
Okay, lack of independent validation. What else?
There's the issue of the Barnum effect and related biases. Critics argue the MBTI relies on this heavily.
The Barnum effect. That's where general statements feel personally accurate,
Right.
like horoscopes.
Precisely. The descriptions for the 16 types are often written to be somewhat desirable, vague, and widely applicable. Things like insightful or analytical. Because they're positive and broad, people easily identify with them, making the results feel deeply accurate, even if they're not uniquely specific. Flattery and confirmation bias play a big role too.
So the descriptions might just be cleverly written to make everyone feel understood. That makes sense. But what about the technical side, like reliability? If it measures something stable, shouldn't you get the same result consistently?
This is a massive criticism. Test-retest reliability appears to be surprisingly low. Sources state that between 39% and 76% of people get a different type when they retake the test after only 5 weeks.
Wait, up to 3/4 of people might change type in just over a month?
According to those studies, yes. Another source bluntly puts it as having a 50% chance of getting a different category after 5 weeks. While the Myers-Briggs company points to higher stability for individual preference scores in newer versions, and maybe around 50% staying the same overall type after 9 months.
50% staying the same still means 50% changing. For something supposedly innate and fixed, that seems shaky.
It definitely raises serious questions about whether it's consistently measuring a stable construct, which leads to the next big issue. Those dichotomies versus continuous traits.
Right, the either categories versus a spectrum.
Exactly. The MBTI forces you into one box or the other, introvert or extrovert, no in between. But most psychological research shows traits like these are normally distributed. Like height, most people are average height, fewer are very tall or very short.
So most people are probably somewhere in the middle on introversion, extroversion too.
Overwhelmingly, yes. Studies show scores tend to cluster around the middle. But the MBTI draws an imaginary dividing line right down that middle. So two people with almost identical scores, but just barely on opposite sides of that line, get put into completely different categories.
Which seems arbitrary and might misrepresent reality for most people who aren't at the extremes.
That's the core of the criticism. It imposes a binary structure onto something that's likely a spectrum.
Okay, and what about that complex dynamic type stack, the dominant auxiliary functions? How does that hold up scientifically?
Not well, according to critics.
Yeah.
The argument is that this whole system of function hierarchies has little empirical evidence backing it. It's a compelling theory, maybe, but lacks strong, verifiable scientific support from controlled studies.
And didn't you mention specific issues with the validity of some scales, particularly SNS, sensing intuition, and TF, thinking feeling?
Yes. Validity asks, does the test actually measure what it claims to measure? A major review back in 1991 by the National Academy of Sciences found that only the EI, extroversion-introversion, scale had strong validity, correlating well with other established measures.
But not the others.
The SN and TF scales showed relatively weak validity. The review concluded there wasn't enough solid research to justify using MBTI for things like career counseling, even calling its popularity troublesome without proven scientific merit. It suggested those scales might not be reliably measuring distinct personality dimensions.
Wow. And what about objectivity? Can people just, fake their answers to get the type they want?
That's another concern. Unlike many psychological tests, the MBTI apparently does not use validity scales. These are built-in checks to see if someone's exaggerating, trying to look good, or just answering randomly. Without them, people can potentially fake their responses, especially in high-stakes situations like job applications, where they might answer how they think they should, not honestly.
Which obviously undermines the whole point. And lastly, the terminology itself. Too vague.
Critics argue, yes, the language in the type descriptions is often very vague in general. While proponents say they're specific, the vagueness makes it easy for almost any behavior to seem like it fits any type, which just boosts that Barnum effect again. It makes the claims hard to actually test or falsify scientifically.
Okay, that's a formidable list of criticisms from the scientific community. How does the Myers-Briggs company push back? What are their counter-arguments?
They do address these points, and it's important to hear their side. For instance, on Jung's skepticism about categorization, they highlight that Jung himself still believed understanding types opens the way to a better understanding, even with limitations. They position the MBTI as a tool to implement his theory, a starting point for self-discovery, not a definitive label.
So framing it as a practical application, acknowledging limitations, what about the reliability data?
This is a key rebuttal. They argue that many criticisms rely on obsolete data from older versions of the test. For the current MBTI Global Step I, they cite much higher test-retest correlations for the individual preference pairs, like E vs I, over several weeks in the 0.8 range, which they term excellent reliability for those specific preferences.
So they're saying the test is improved and critics are using old numbers.
That's their argument, yes. Though it's worth noting, the stability of the overall four-letter type still seems to be lower than the stability of individual preference pairs.
Okay. And what about the use of the test, especially for things like hiring?
They are very, very clear on this. They emphasize the MBTI isn't designed to predict success in a given occupation. It's purely descriptive about preferences. They strongly condemn its misuse for hiring or screening, saying it harms both employer and employee because it wasn't built for prediction.
So their stance is, don't blame the tool for how people misuse it.
Essentially, yes. Some defenders argue that much criticism targets the test's scientific origins or psychometric stats in a way that misses its practical usefulness for self-awareness, team communication, etc., when applied correctly and ethically.
Interesting. So despite the scientific debate, how does the MBTI actually stack up against the Big Five if you compare their scales? Is there overlap?
There definitely is. Research shows clear correlations. The MBTI's EI scale strongly correlates with the Big Five's extroversion.
Okay.
SN, sensing intuition, correlates with openness to experience. TF, thinking feeling, correlates with agreeableness. And JP, judging perceiving, correlates with conscientiousness.
So 4 of the MBTI dimensions map pretty well onto 4 of the Big Five dimensions.
They do show overlap, yes. But connecting this to the bigger picture, a key takeaway is that the MBTI fundamentally lacks a measure for emotional stability dimension. That 5th Big Five factor, neuroticism, is just missing.
And you said earlier that neuroticism is really crucial in psychology.
Absolutely. It's a major predictor of things like depression, anxiety, overall mental well-being. So the MBTI captures some aspects similar to the Big Five, but it completely omits this critically important dimension related to emotional resilience and psychological health.
Which is a pretty significant gap from a clinical or research perspective.
It's a huge gap. As prominent Big Five researchers McRae and Costa concluded, their analyses showed no support for the view that the MBTI measures truly dichotomous preferences or qualitatively distinct types. Instead, the instrument measures 4 relatively independent dimensions that align with 4 of the Big Five traits. This really reinforces why the academic world leans towards continuous trait models.
Okay, this brings us to our final segment, segment 6. Beyond the score, real-world impact and responsible implementation. We've talked theory, science, critiques. Now let's look at how these tests are actually used day to day and the ethical side of things.
Right, because despite all the scientific debate, the use of these tests in the workplace is massive and still growing. We mentioned that 70% figure for Fortune 500s using them in hiring.
Yeah.
But they're also used really extensively for team building, leadership development, identifying high-potential employees, improving communication, all sorts of internal HR functions.
Can you share some specific examples from the sources, companies actually using these and seeing results?
Sure. Deloitte, the big consulting firm, apparently used assessments to fine-tune their leadership programs. They found that leaders who had a better understanding of their own personalities were reportedly 27% more effective.
27% more effective just from better self-awareness. That's substantial.
It is. Another interesting one is the U.S. Army using the MBTI specifically to try and achieve better communication among troops. The idea is understanding different styles helps teams work better together, especially under pressure.
Makes sense in that context.
And American Express uses the Predictive Index, another assessment tool, not just for skills, but to align new hires with company values. They reported seeing a 20% increase in employee retention from people hired using that approach.
Wow, 20% better retention is a huge deal for any company. So these tools can have positive impacts when used strategically.
Definitely. The success stories show that when you choose reputable tools and integrate them thoughtfully into a broader strategy, they can yield real benefits. But how they're implemented is absolutely crucial, and the ethical considerations are paramount.
Okay, let's talk about those best practices for responsible implementation. How can companies use these powerful tools ethically and effectively?
So a real delicate balance. One key recommendation is to align the assessment directly with the actual job requirements.
Not just use a generic test for everyone.
Right. Sources suggest that when tests measure traits genuinely relevant to that specific role, performance can improve by about 15%. It's about targeted assessment, not one-size-fits-all.
Okay, that makes sense. What else is crucial?
Educating hiring managers is vital. They need to understand the nuances, what a test can tell you, what it cannot tell you, how to interpret results without bias. This helps avoid misusing a descriptive tool like MBTI as if it were predictive, which is a major pitfall.
So understanding the limitations is as important as the strengths.
Absolutely. Then there's transparent communication. Being open with candidates and employees about how the results will be used builds trust and fosters a more inclusive culture. People deserve to know the purpose.
Transparency is key. And should tests be used alone?
Definitely not. The strong recommendation is to use personality tests in conjunction with other evaluation methods, things like structured interviews, skills tests, work samples. IBM apparently saw a 20% improvement in employee retention by combining assessments with interviews and skill tests. It gives a much more rounded, fair picture.
So it's just one piece of a bigger puzzle, not the whole picture.
Exactly. A multifaceted approach is always best practice.
Wow, okay. We have covered so much ground in this deep dive today. We started with that really basic human urge to understand ourselves and others, the thing that makes personality tests so incredibly magnetic.
Yeah, that fundamental curiosity.
Then we really dug into the details, contrasting the MBTI with its Jungian roots, its focus on types, its accessibility against the Big Five, the academic gold standard with its trait-based, data-driven dimensions.
And we didn't shy away from the heavy scientific criticisms aimed at the MBTI, the issues around reliability, validity, those binary categories.
Right. But we also made sure to include the Myers-Briggs company's responses, their perspective on outdated data, and the importance of intended use versus misuse.
Which is crucial for a balanced view.
And finally, we looked at the real-world applications and, critically, those best practices for using these tools responsibly and ethically, especially in the workplace.
You know, what really stands out from all this is that these tests, regardless of the scientific debate swirling around them, they clearly tap into something deep within us, that need to categorize, to understand, to find patterns.
Yeah.
Even the press critics might call bad ones. They still fulfill a function, don't they? They satisfy our curiosity, give us discussion points, and sometimes offer that really powerful feeling of belonging. That I am French fry moment can be incredibly validating.
Totally. That sense of, oh, there are other people like me.
Yeah.
Okay, so for you listening, as you process all of this, here's maybe a final thought to chew on.
Mm-hmm.
Given the mixed scientific reviews, the potential for misuse, the ethical tightropes, what do you think the true value of these personality tests really is? Is it about getting definitive labels, predicting the future?
Or is it maybe something else?
Yeah. Is it maybe less about the answers they give and more about the questions they provoke? Could their real value lie in sparking that self-reflection, starting conversations, pushing us on that journey of self-discovery?
That's a great question. How does knowing all this, the science, the history, the critiques, the ethics, how does it change how you look at these tests next time you encounter one, whether it's for personal insight or in a professional setting?
Because this deep dive, really, it's just the start, isn't it? It's an invitation to continue your own exploration into what truly makes you and the people around you tick.